Galapagos Islands have some of the world's most remarkable wildlife, but warming waters are jeopardizing the delicate balance of life there.
The Galapagos Islands are home to some of the planet's most incredible wildlife, but rising ocean temperatures are now jeopardizing the delicate ecosystem there. Long considered a representation of unspoiled beauty, the islands are commonly referred to as a living museum of unique species that can be found nowhere else on the planet. But hidden beneath this beauty is a tale that few strangers know, a tale of an invasion so devastating that it took this paradise to the edge of collapse. We had been island hopping in the Galapagos for many days while we toured its islands, and on this morning, when we arrived at sunrise, we were welcomed by regal creatures that capture the uniqueness of the archipelago. The problem started with a small number of animals, transported by accident and circumstance, which replicated into an uncontainable power. Goats were let loose on the islands, and what happened amazed everybody. For millions of years, the Galapagos Islands had drifted like green jewels in the enormous Pacific Ocean, away from the commotion of the world outside. This solitude created a fragile, otherworldly environment in which every plant and animal had a function dictated by gradual evolution. Among its most famous residents were the huge Galapagos tortoises, living testaments to time, some reaching up to 5 feet in length and several hundred pounds in weight. These tortoises were not merely passive animals. They were gardeners of the islands, grazing continuously on vegetation, breaking paths, and scattering seeds with their dung. Near the top of Wolf Volcano's rocky flanks, pink iguanas, rare as they are, lay basking in the sun, their scales dully gleaming against rock. Seabirds, from blue-footed boobies to splendid frigate birds, nested on cliffs and shores, rearing new generations out of the way of predators while their cries resonated across the salty air. The plants of the islands flourished, too, from giant scalesia trees to low cushion vegetation, all specially adapted to their microclimates. For millennia, this ecosystem varied only at a geological speed. New species would come once every 10,000 years, and every time they came, they changed the course of evolution for good. But when humans first landed on these shores in 1535, the delicate balance was disrupted. Spanish mariners of the Discovery era hunted tortoises, collected resources, and charted the islands. The enduring change, though, came not from what they did, but from what they brought with them, animals and cargo that would forever transform the isolation of the islands. With centuries passing, as the ships moved through, invasive forces quietly began insidiously infiltrating. By the early 1800s, the setting was in place for one of the most devastating invasions. Pirates, whalers, and trading ships started to use the Galapagos as a rest stop for food, drinking water, and rest. Crews hunted tortoises, collected eggs, and replenished supplies. Sailors carried goats to keep themselves fed on long voyages as a milk, meat, and breeding animal supply. Some of them escaped, others were let go on purpose, and what was a seemingly innocuous action turned into an ecological catastrophe. On these predator-free islands, the goats thrived rapidly and bred at a disquieting rate. In decades, a small group of animals grew to thousands. These were not like tortoises, which fed selectively on forages. Goats were ravenous and unselective. They chewed on shrubs, grasses, and young saplings, defoliating landscapes to the ground. Plants that had been formed over millennia without defenses, no thorns, no poison, no hard leaves, could not resist. Soils crumbled, habitats disintegrated, and greenery turned to brown dust. Indigenous species were now fighting to survive in a world remapped by these invasive grazers. By the mid-20th century, the destruction was irrefutable. On islands like Isabela, Santiago, and Pinta, formerly lush slopes were barren wastelands of rock and dust. Heavy rainfall swept away loose soil, streams became red with sediment, and aquatic ecosystems suffered. Giant tortoises perished as their food supply disappeared. On Pinta Island, the devastation was so severe that the indigenous tortoise population totally broke down, leaving only a sole survivor, Lonesome George, who would go on to become an eerie reminder of the island's ecological disaster. In recognition of the crisis, Ecuador in 1959 made the Galapagos Islands a national park, and conservation became a matter of national concern. Feral goats were determined to be the biggest danger, and extermination efforts commenced. Local hunters, the Ecuadorian army, and international volunteers joined forces. Yet the task was daunting. Goats proved resilient, clever, and difficult to eliminate. The first 90% of any herd could be culled, but the last 10% adapted, hiding in caves, climbing inaccessible ridges, and evading hunters. These survivors quickly repopulate, undoing years of work. By the 1980s, it was clear that traditional methods were failing, the goats were winning. The scope of the destruction amazed scientists globally. Surveys indicated that over 90% of indigenous plant cover on certain islands had been obliterated. Seed banks in the ground were completely eliminated, rendering the ground sterile and incapable of recolonizing naturally. Even if the goats were eliminated, recovery would not be assured without human assistance. On the northern slopes of Isabela, where the critically endangered pink iguana lives, persistent erosion had erased valuable topsoil, exposing volcanic rock. Scientists cautioned that if nothing was done, the islands would pass a point of no return, becoming ecological wastelands forever. The Galapagos crisis was not an isolated incident. Around the world, goats brought in by humans had destroyed island ecosystems. On New Zealand, they stripped forests and killed seabird colonies. In Hawaii, they drove rare plants to the brink of extinction. Even in South Georgia, goats changed water systems and obliterated tundra habitats. The pattern was always the same: goats came, bred, and ecosystems fell apart. Galapagos, though, had an opportunity to fight this destiny. By 1997, the Galapagos National Park Directorate, with the help of foreign funding, initiated Project Isabella, the world's biggest and most ambitious invasive mammal eradication program ever attempted. The aim was audacious and straightforward: eradicate every last goat. Sharpshooters rode out in helicopters over rough landscape, methodically removing tens of thousands of goats. Within months, green shoots started appearing, heralding the first real signs of recovery. But even a handful of surviving goats could spoil it all. To fix this, conservationists adopted a clever tactic: the Judas goat. Sterilized goats with radio collars were released in the wild. Attracted by instinct to join herds, they betrayed their friends unknowingly. The signals directed the hunters to concealed populations that otherwise would have lived. The tactic paid off. Northern Isabela, which had been home to over 100,000 goats, was pronounced goat-free by 2006. Not only did this save the Galapagos from ruin, but it served as a template for the eradication of invasive animals globally. As goats vanished, recovery rebounded. Vegetation burst with new growth, soils regained vitality, and wildlife returned. Giant tortoise populations rose, pink iguanas gained stable homes, and desolate landscapes became green once more. The Galapagos became a testament that ecosystems can heal if forces of destruction are removed entirely. Partial removals would never have worked, only total elimination guaranteed restoration. And the struggle was not only ecological. It was also social. For most island dwellers, goats provided a source of sustenance and livelihood. Conservationists made sure that the local population was a partner in the process. Local guides, such as naturalist Celso Montalvo, served as ambassadors for the island's restoration, enlightening visitors to the danger that invasive species represented and how their presence helped conservation. Notables such as Carl Campbell stressed true success was empowering locals to become stewards of their surroundings. The Galapagos tale demonstrates that conserving nature cannot be separated from working with people. Conservation is not just about eradicating non-native animals or safeguarding threatened species, it is about a collective vision where nature recovery and human well-being go hand in hand. Without such collaboration, the islands could have been irretrievably lost. With it, they became a symbol of hope for conservation globally. This enabled sharpshooters to find the otherwise elusive and dispersed goat herds with unprecedented ease. Regardless of how isolated or mountainous the island's terrain was, Judas goats served as unwitting guides for their fellow conquerors. The tactic was brutal but genius. It used the goats' own instincts against them as a killing weakness. Every year, the herds dwindled as each band was hunted down and eliminated systematically. By 2006, a goal that most considered impossible was achieved. Northern Isabella Island was officially goat-free. This was a dramatic reversal of fortunes for an island that had at one time hosted more than 100,000 feral goats, an ecosystem once decimated by their uncontrolled grazing. This breakthrough tactic not only revolutionized conservation efforts in the Galapagos but also found itself replicated as a model for invasive species management globally. The Judas goat technique demonstrated that with determination and imagination, even the most deep-rooted environmental issues could be resolved. Recovery on wheels. The goat's removal triggered an eco-recovery wave as awe-inspiring as it was optimistic. Relieved of the constant stress of invading herbivores, native vegetation started to reclaim the land. Trees that had been denuded by goat grazing began to grow new leaves, their boughs stretching towards the sky as if rejoicing at their new opportunity to flourish. The soil, previously eroded and hardened by hooves and subjected to extreme weather, began to regain its capacity to hold water and support the growth of seeds. Wildlife quickly responded to these advances. Giant tortoises, the original architects of the island's ecosystems, began to bounce back with numbers increasing by thousands. The pink iguanas, which had been on the brink of collapse, found refuge in the rejuvenated habitats, their population stabilizing for the first time in decades. On Santiago Island, areas that had been barren and lifeless for more than 50 years turned a vivid green, a clear and visible testament to nature's resilience. The recovery was living proof of a broader truth. Ecosystems can heal themselves if the threats that disrupt their balance are fully removed. This meant that partial or half measures were simply not enough. Complete elimination of invasive species alone could re-establish the fragile ecological balance. Scientists and conservationists alike observed this change with guarded hope. The Galapagos Islands, once on the brink of irrevocable destruction, were now a shining example of what concerted human action, coupled with nature's inbuilt strength, could accomplish. This achievement sparked a new zeal for the preservation of other threatened ecosystems around the world, proving that although harm to nature can be extensive, restoration is feasible, but it requires absolute resolve and creative solutions. The human element. Conservation in the Galapagos Islands involved much more than a biological and ecological domain. It was inextricably linked to the social order, politics, and everyday life of the inhabitants of the islands. The problem of eradicating the wild goats wasn't a scientific challenge, but a multifaceted human task involving the judicious balance of communal interests, cultural attitudes, and economic considerations. To most of the local residents, goats were an essential source of food and, in others, a way of life. Their cooperation was necessary for the eradication programs to advance, so conservationists worked alongside the local people to build understanding and common objectives. Carl Campbell, one of the top conservationists heavily involved, knew this better than anyone. He was determined that conservation had to happen with local leadership, making the outcomes of the recovery tangible and seen by all. This involved not only the removal of goats, but making people in the community custodians of their own land. Conservation was a common goal where the return of the island's natural beauty and diversity was tied directly to economic and social benefits. Local residents like Celso Montalvo were key players in this mix. Montalvo, who was a naturalist with a first-hand knowledge of the islands, became a spokesperson for their tale. Tourists